So this session we'll be talking about Black women and mass incarceration. And there's a quote on this slide. Over the past quarter century, there's been a profound change in the involvement of women within the criminal justice system. This is the result of more expansive law enforcement efforts, stiffer drug sentencing laws, and post-conviction barriers to reentry that uniquely affect women. And that's a quote from the Sentencing Project. I do partner with the National Alliance of Faith and Justice, and we have What's Love Got to Do with it. And I need to pull out specific wording that's revolved around love, L-O-V-E. And the words that I chose for this session deal with legacy, because we're going to talk about Black History Month, and O for options. And we'll see how some women don't have options. And because of that situation, it leads them into this system. And then also V for vulnerability. I know you all have, read in my story and basically how, being in vulnerable situations will cause you to go down a certain path as well. And then also E with entanglements and how relationships can lead you down a certain path as well. So the question is always on the same slide, and I hope you're able to answer this by the completion of the program. Is what lessons have you learned about love? This month being Black History Month, and I believe every day we should be celebrating our history, our nation's history with Black history, because there were Black people that helped to build this nation, and there was a struggle of African cultures coming over to this country. And basically through my incarceration, studying Black history basically gave me strength. And I got to this point, and I don't know if I shared this in a previous session, but while I was incarcerated in Danbury, Connecticut, there were two white women that taught this Black history class. And I can remember telling myself, like, why they're teaching this Black history class. And I would hear other women talking on the yard as well. And they were saying, well, who are these two white women teaching this Black history class? What are they going to teach us about Black history? And I can remember telling myself, well, shoot, I don't have anything else to do. Let me go see what they're talking about. And I found out that these two women, white women, were affiliated with our movement, our Black movement, and trying to help move us forward. And they were allies. And I soaked up as much information as I could. And I can remember initially I was upset at the fact that they knew more history about me than I knew about myself. And so I eventually, through my time in prison, they ended up transferring, and I eventually took over teaching their Black history class in that prison. But I just wanted to share a few tidbits about Black History Month. Basically, it grew out of Negro History Week, and the brainchild of the noted historian was the noted historian Carter G. Woodson and other prominent African Americans. And since 1976, every US president has officially designated the month of February as Black History Month. And, I even Googled it and saw where, Biden had put out a statement with regarding Black History Month as well. Other countries across the world, including Canada and the UK, also devote a month to celebrating Black history. But basically, Carter G. Woodson and a prominent minister, Jesse Moreland, founded the Association for the Study of Negro Life and History. And this organization is dedicated to researching and promoting achievements by Black Americans and other peoples of African descent. And so basically, this group sponsored a National Negro History Week in 1926. And they chose the second week of February to coincide with the birthdays of Abraham Lincoln and Frederick Douglass. And basically, this event inspired schools and communities nationwide to organize local celebration, establish history clubs, and host performances and lectures. And basically, through the decades, mayors of cities across the country began issuing yearly proclamations recognizing Negro History Week. And by the late 1960s, thanks to the civil rights movement, a growing awareness of Black history. Negro History Week evolved into Black History Month. So, hence why we have this. But I believe that we should be celebrating our history every at 365 throughout the year. So, as I talked about with the letter L and legacy, and on the strength of, I know my mom is listening to this call. Basically, my legacy and history, um, my mom has told me stories about her parents and her father having to pick tobacco back in history. And I just thought this video clip um, tied really close to my legacy and my culture and my history within my family, because ultimately, back in the day with my parents, um, my grandfather basically encouraged the boys, her brothers, to go into the military. But with the girls, he encouraged education, and he helped them, financially go to Norfolk State University, which is where Norfolk State and Virginia State, which is the colleges where they graduated from. But my mom speaks frequently about how they used to pick tobacco in the fields, and basically education was what they preached, and how she got out of, living in that particular situation. So she was the first generation of going off to college. So with that history, though, as far as having to work in the tobacco fields, I thought it was important for this session, as we talk about Black women and incarceration, for us to look at the history and go back to the origins of it.
African American women were an important part of the chain gang labor force. Just like African American men and white men, they were required to participate in the construction of roads and bridges and in turpentine production. So they weren't exempt from hard manual labor and were required to do the same type of labor as men. The percentage of African American chain gang laborers was over 90%, with African American men comprising the largest majority. African American women were right behind, comprising approximately 5% of the chain gang population, with white men comprising 6% of the chain gang population, and white women comprising less than 0.1% of the chain gang population. The chain gang system in Georgia lasted until around the 1940s, and the chain gang system was brought down after the publication of Robert Burns's I'm a Fugitive from a Georgia Chain Gang, which fleshed out or brought to public attention the atrocities of the chain gang system of Georgia. And Burns was a white man. It takes a white man to bring it to the fore in order for officials to put forth a serious effort to bring forth the abolition.
So, in introducing my friend Talitha LaFlouria, she is the Lisa Smith Discovery Associate Professor of African and African American Studies at the University of Virginia, and author of the multi-award winning Chained in Silence: Black Women and Convict Labor in the New South. She is a scholar of African American history and a specialist on Black women, mass incarceration, and the legacies of American history. Dr. LaFlouria's work has been featured in The Atlantic, The Washington Post, Miss Magazine, The Root, and Vox. She has made appearances on NPR, C-SPAN, and in several PBS documentaries, including the Sundance Award nominated film Slavery by Another Name. Dr. LaFlouria has received several prestigious awards for her research, including a 2018-2020 Andrew Carnegie Fellowship from the Carnegie Corporation of New York. She currently serves on the board of directors for Historians Against Slavery. And so, Dr. LaFlouria, my girlfriend Talitha, I'm so very proud to have you as a guest today. And I don't know if you all noticed, the institute that she represents at UVA is actually Carter G. Woodson, who was founder of Black History Week and all its glory. And so Talitha, I just want to, because I know, she probably didn't even want this formal bio read or anything like that. But Talitha, we met December 2018 in California. We went to a training there that was hosted by Susan Burton, and I'll share a little bit about her towards the end of the presentation. But it has been such a blessing. Talitha, you're such a strong supporter, and I just enjoy all of our conversations. And so for me today, I really just wanted to highlight you and your work. And so, in my previous presentations where, I speak before, people, I always talk about the 13th Amendment and how it basically made slavery illegal with the exception of if you commit a crime. And then I share how my experience was the closest that I could have come to what our ancestors endured, because since the federal government convicted me of a crime, I put myself in a position to be treated as a slave. But it goes deeper than that. And so, as my friend and expert, I kind of wanted you to go into the history of slavery, Black women, and mass incarceration. And so, I don't know if you want to start somewhere, but one of my questions was, can you explain why the 14th Amendment didn't actually abolish slavery? And I guess what you were speaking about in the video clip with the chain gangs, and if you could go into that and kind of educate us more.
Yeah, oh, definitely. First of all, thank you so much for that generous introduction. That's not the introduction I sent to you, but thank you so much. I just really appreciate you. This is an honor, to participate in this wonderful, youth leadership program that you put together. I'm so proud of you, and I just am grateful to be able to share my voice or share my 2 cents on how I see, this history evolving. I will definitely address the question, but I actually prepared some remarks. I don't know which direction we should go in first.
In your direction.
Okay, so I want to just, take some time to just, lay out this history and, to talk about how the historical impact, right, of mass incarceration on Black women. Talk a little bit about its connections to slavery, its historical foundations, and obviously its races past and present. As some of you may know, or for those of you who keep up with these statistics, today 1 in 100 Black women are under the supervision of the U.S. criminal and justice system. And this includes women who are on probation and parole. Although Black women make up only 13% of women in the country, they represent 30% of the women's prison population and 44% of women in jail. During the height of the first war on drugs, these numbers were even higher, particularly during the 1980s and 1990s. So there are a few reasons why I believe that, Black women are oftentimes ignored in conversations about mass incarceration or about its history. I believe, first of all, the overemphasis on the plight of Black men and their experiences within the criminal and justice system has resulted in the obscuring of Black women's experiences of mass incarceration across time and space. Their negligible numbers when compared with Black men punished by the carceral state, I believe, has been used as an excuse to justify their erasure. And then the recent focus on the opioid quote unquote crisis that has shifted the conversation to white women who are being mass incarcerated for the first time in American history for drug offenses may cause us to lose sight of Black women altogether. So let me just say that there has never been a time in American history when Black women have not experienced extreme rates of arrest, conviction, and incarceration in the nation's jails and prisons. The mass incarceration epidemic has disproportionately affected Black women for over 150 years. And I'll just very briefly, lay that out and explain I'll lay that out and just provide, examples and details of this, of what Black women's historical experiences have been. This epidemic can be traced to slavery, where the earliest roots of racism and mass incarceration were first laid. First of all, the domestic slave trade, also referred to as the Second Middle Passage or internal slave trade, fueled the first wave of Black mass incarceration. Over 1 million enslaved people were trafficked through slave jails, and they were stored in these temporary holding facilities until they were sold to the Deep South. And in Richmond and Alexandria, Virginia, these were two of the primary hubs for the internal slave trade. And so most scholars really don't pay attention to the experiences of enslaved people who were held in these jails, because for some reason, people don't seem to believe that a person could be enslaved and incarcerated simultaneously. But the reality is that these places were fortified just like jails. They had armed guards. Oftentimes they had huge, 13, 16-foot fences or gates surrounding these jails. The windows were covered with bars. People were locked inside. If they ran away, they were pursued by guards. And so there's really no distinction between what we see in our modern carceral system and what enslaved people were experiencing, over 150 years ago. Just to give an example, the Franklin and Armfield Company headquarters in Alexandria, Virginia, which is one of the most notorious slave jails which was one of the most notorious slave jails in America, held, up to 100 people at a time. Now, that may sound like, a small number compared to jails today, but those were, really high numbers. And there were lots of slave jails throughout the country, and they were all over the place. They were in Louisiana and Texas, Washington, D.C., Maryland, Virginia, all over. And so, like I said, people were trapped on the inside and then sold. And so the business of punishment, right, that we know so much about in this prison industrial complex essentially has its roots in, slavery, but it actually begins to really take shape in the post-emancipation period. And I'll talk a little bit more about the convict leasing system that follows slavery that in many ways, to me, reflects, the birth of the prison industrial complex. So just to segue, first of all, thousands of enslaved women were in prison before the Civil War, and hundreds, if not thousands, of free Black women experienced incarceration as well. They also suffered the tragic effects of the slave trade, and I'll just give you a quick example. Women like Louisa Brown, for example, were carried to the old slave market in Richmond and put on the auction block. Now, Louisa was a free woman. She had been arrested and jailed for 6 months prior to being sold for allegedly failing to register as a free person in the Commonwealth of Virginia. So if you were free, every 3 years you had to re-register and you had to pay, a fee. And you also had to keep, freedom papers on you. And she wasn't in possession of her papers. So she was billed $67.15 worth of jail fees, which is the approximate today of, which is the equivalent, of approximately $2,406 today. So freedom came, with a hidden cost that she couldn't afford to pay. Obviously, as a working class, poor Black woman, recently freed, she couldn't afford to pay those fines. So what did they do? They basically sold her labor. She was sold to a white man named, John J. Mountcastle for 59 years, right? So she was basically put back into slavery. Most Black prisoners, when you include those confined in Southern slave jails, were not convicted of a crime. Having Black skin was their only crime, right? So we see this as a consistent pattern, even today. And when I think about, debtors' prisons, and I think about, the cash bail problem, when I think about, all of these modern forms of debt slavery, it reminds me so much of Louisa's story and the stories of so many thousands of Black women who, even after emancipation, were, put on chain gangs or forced to work on debt peonage camps and had their labor sold to, private individuals or hired out to counties and had their labor exploited for profit. So after the Civil War, thousands of formerly enslaved Black people were arrested and imprisoned and forced to work in a system known as convict leasing. Between 1866 and 1928, every single Southern state in America practiced convict leasing. And so convict leasing was a system that allowed private companies to lease prisoners from the state for a fee. Black men represented over 90% of the entire prison population of the South, but Black women represented over 90% of the female prison populations of the South, right? In the state of Georgia, Black women represented 99% of the female prison population. And in the state's entire convict leasing history from 1868 to 1908, 3 white women were incarcerated, right, in convict lease camps. So when we talk about racial disparities, right, and how, Black women are overrepresented in the prison population today and have been, over decades and centuries, this is a prime example of how, this is a prime example of how what we're witnessing today is not a new phenomenon, but it's a continuation of longstanding practices that have been with us, again, since the period of slavery. Emancipation, to me, marked the beginning of a new war on Black freedom. It started with the creation of Black codes, which were a set of laws put in place to regulate and restrict the freedom of formerly enslaved people. This enabled white judges, police, and lawmakers to lock up formerly enslaved people and their children for nonviolent quality of life misdemeanor, quote unquote, crimes, such as stealing food, loitering, not having a job, disorderly conduct, spitting in public, not moving off the sidewalk for a white person, being Black, walking while Black, breathing while Black, you could be locked up. County judges then forced thousands of Black women and girls to do hard labor on chain gangs for being too poor to pay fines, for prostitution, because for many of them, that was the only, safe employment option that they saw. They didn't want to work on the fields, and for many of them, they didn't want to work as domestics in white households and expose themselves to the danger of being raped by their white employers. And it happened frequently, during slavery, and even after emancipation, Black women were raped with impunity by employers and within this carceral system in these prison camps. And so, some women also were put on chain gangs for not being able to pay fines that resulted from bootlegging liquor. Some of them sold liquor to make a living. Sometimes they, stole. I remember reading the case of a 15-year-old girl who, stole some baby dresses. She had just given birth. She stole some baby dresses and was arrested, and she couldn't pay the $5 fine. So they put her on a chain gang for 6 months. So let me just speed up here. Black women who were convicted.
Talitha, you are doing fine. So
Okay.
I heard you said, let me speed up here. This is
Okay.
dropping knowledge. So please.
Okay. All right. I just didn't want to take up too much time. Okay. So there's another example I want to share of a woman. This story really touched me, of an 18-year-old girl named Lizzie Boatwright. Lizzie was sentenced to 6 months hard labor on a Georgia chain gang after she was accused of stealing $5, like the other young woman that I told you about, worth of garments. And so they gave her a $50 fine, right? She couldn't pay it. Her family couldn't pay it. Her community couldn't come up with that kind of money, right? And so they put her on a chain gang. They dressed her up in a suit of men's stripes and brogan shoes and had her out there working with the men on a chain gang. And, the inspector, because every once in a while the camps will be inspected, rarely, probably once or twice a year. An inspector found her working basically as a man, and she provided this really compelling testimony of how, and I hope I don't like, I'm trying to, be mindful of the audience, and I'm hoping that I'm gonna go ahead and issue a trigger warning. Um, she talked about the struggles of being a woman, right, on the chain gang, and how when she couldn't put out enough work, the chain gang operator, as they call them, and whipping bosses in the convict leasing context, would strip her in front of the men and flog her naked. And she talked about how one time she was quote unquote sick with her monthlies, meaning that she was on her menstrual cycle. And she begged this man, not to beat her in front of them and beat her, she actually asked him if he could do it in private, right? Can you imagine asking for your beating to take place in private? And he refused. So he, whipped her on her menses in front of all of these men. And the reason why he whipped her is because she complained that her feet were hurting because of the brogan shoes, and she asked him for rags to put in the shoes to protect her toes. And so this just gives, one of, oh my gosh, numerous examples that I can point to of the kinds of, abuse and terror that these women experienced, which again included sexual abuse and terror as well. So just to say a little bit about labor, Black women convicted of felonies such as murder or manslaughter, arson, which oftentimes resulted from self-defense. And, as I'm sure Professor Ritchie will discuss, this is also a very common story. Majority of the women, over 70% of Black women who were convicted of felonies in Georgia during the post-Civil War period were they claimed self-defense. They defended themselves against abusive fathers who were physically abusing them, sexually abusing them, abusive spouses, lovers, brothers. And so they were oftentimes put in prison, and most of them were sentenced to life and forced to work, ultimately becoming the labor that helped rebuild the post-Civil War South. So, just to give you an example, they were forced to grade surfaces for railroads, to lay railroad tracks, to mine clay, to fire bricks, to dig ditches, to smelt iron, build roads, chop down trees, harvest turpentine, plow fields, hoe weeds, wash clothes, cook meals, and pick crops. And, in the course of their dizzying work routines, they also, expended a fair amount of energy fighting off sexual predators. Give you an example, women like Ella Gamble, who was a wife and a mother of a newborn who was incarcerated for life, sentenced to life in prison for allegedly poisoning her employer. Now, I don't know, if she was guilty of the crime or not, but there are just so many different scenarios or reasons that I can think of as to why, she may have felt it necessary to take his life. Nobody knows what kind of abusive situation she may have been in. Oftentimes, these women lived inside of the homes of the people that they worked for. So I don't have those kinds of details because they're not available in the historical record. But from what I could, ascertain from records, she was shuffled between 5 prison factories and plantations over the course of her 20 years of incarceration. She spent her days running from a whip or the sexual predator on the other end of that whip. By the time Ella Gamble was released from captivity, because she was dying of cancer of the womb, bladder, and rectum, and was of no longer value to the state, and so they gave her a medical clemency. Ella had given birth to 6 children. She was a newlywed with one when she came in. Several of them were quote unquote born dead. So you figure that out. right? And I have seen multiple examples of children being killed in these prison camps. And there was one camp in particular called Camp Hermont, run by a former slaveholder named William Maddox, who on his standing order would tell the guards to quote unquote drown the bastards in the river when women gave birth as a result of rape in the camp. So, just to give another example, there was a woman that Maddie Crawford, right, who she came into the prison camp, wearing dresses. They beat her out of her dresses and made her work as a blacksmith. And so, I can tell you dozens of stories like these about women like Ella Gamble, about women like Maddie Crawford. And I've even heard stories like these from women I've interviewed from our forthcoming book, which is titled Searching for Jane Crow. And the women I've spoken with, they can relate obviously to being over incarcerated, to being having their labor exploited by the state. They know what it means to be violently assaulted by guards and to have their humanity opposed. And so for me, doing this work, I recognize now more than ever, like how important it is to make these connections between past and present and to tell this history in its comprehensive form and not just one aspect of it. And so I really look forward to the rest of our conversation, and I'm going to go ahead and wrap there. But to answer real quick your question about the 13th Amendment. Okay, so the 13th Amendment basically stated that slavery was legally abolished, except as punishment for crime. So when people, committed crimes, quote unquote crimes, they could be forced into involuntary servitude through systems like the debt peonage system, like convict leasing, like the chain gang system. And this was entirely legal. But what I will also point out is that the states also had their own laws. And so, for example, they had vagrancy laws that the states issued vagrancy laws that allowed them literally to sell free people into slavery, but they only were able to do it because of the existence of the 13th Amendment. They had the protection of the federal, or they had the impunity, right, to do it because of the existence of the 13th Amendment. So the 13th Amendment was really wide reaching. And even if it wasn't drawn up with that intent, it had drastic consequences because what it allowed for is for slavery to be reestablished legally for, multiple decades leading far into the 20th century. So.
Woo, Talitha. There's an echo. Hopefully it'll go away. It's going away.
On my end?
No, on my
okay.
end. Talitha, oh my goodness. You are a powerhouse. I mean, if I was on UVA's campus, your people should be rushing trying to sign up for your class. But I have to say, like after this session, y'all, I'm gonna have to light me a candle, give me some tea, glass of wine, something, because it's too early for wine. But for me, it's traumatizing to hear this history, this root, and then to actually be a person to have gotten to have been subjected to this criminal injustice system. So for me, I'm gonna brush it off, but one of the questions that you can answer later towards the end is, what can we do to bring this history more to the forefront? Because in the midst of the trauma and me tearing up, and I'm gonna get it together, I think the more, because when I was incarcerated, I did more reading into history and culture, but I think to know more and to expose myself more, as Black people, we talk about spiritual nourishment, but for me, I think also too, and not just Black people, all cultures is part of this American history, that if you gain some of our experience, that I could also build myself up a resistance to basically be empowered and to be stronger as a woman, hearing some of these testimonies of what women went through in the past. So Talitha, if you get towards the end, tell us what we can do to help to bring this history more to the forefront. So I thank you again. And next, we will hear from my dear friend, Dr. Beth Ritchie. And we go way back, y'all, way back. And Beth, as I was preparing for this session, I saw it's some lecture series on YouTube, and I had the name of it. But you spoke about catching the train, from Harlem, and I know during that particular time you were working at Hunter College, but in preparing and listening to you, for people that are part of this call that you don't have this knowledge, but Beth was actually working with the Legal Defense Fund, the NAACP, the Legal Defense Fund, to help bring me home. And so one of the things that I'm constantly in gratitude to Beth for was that she helped me not wither away in a corner, because I was constantly thinking about the choices that I made and getting into this relationship. Because I told you all from the beginning of this program, my crime wasn't that I was criminally minded. My crime was that I chose this relationship. And I've stopped saying I chose the wrong relationship. And so it's been being around people like Beth that has helped to empower me, to help me not wither and ball up, but to be empowered to share my story and share my experience so that others can learn from it. And so in in and so I'm just going to let this video introduce Beth, and Beth doesn't know that I'm showing, neither did Talitha, but it's something that I found online that could help the youth know more of who you are.
My name is Beth Ritchie. I'm the director of the Institute for Research on Race and Public Policy and professor in departments of African American Studies and Criminology, Law, and Justice. The fact that UIC is in the city of Chicago is tremendously important to my research, which focuses on violence against African American women and their subsequent involvement in the criminal legal system. So it really focuses on the ways that domestic violence and sexual assault and stalking and criminalized substance abuse leads to women's incarceration. It matters a great deal to me to be able to do my research in disadvantaged urban communities. Engaged research and what we think of as activist scholarship is really a hallmark of UIC. Many of my colleagues at UIC are engaged in issues that affect real people in very profound and important ways. And I would say the majority of us engage in the kind of research that will make a difference on the ground. So we not only study people, but we try to understand the dynamics that lead to social problems of race and class and gender and sexuality, and then influence the public policies and programmatic changes that will make some of the disadvantages that communities experience go away.
In introducing Beth, I'm going to read the bio. I know you don't want me to, but I'm going to do it anyway. Beth Ritchie is head of the Department of Criminology, Law, and Justice and professor of Black Studies at the University of Illinois at Chicago. The emphasis of her scholarly and activist work has been on the ways that race, ethnicity, and social position affect women's experience of violence and incarceration, focusing on the experiences of African American battered women and sexual assault survivors. Dr. Ritchie is the author of Arrested Justice, Black Women, Violence, and America's Prison Nation, which chronicles the evolution of contemporary anti-violence movement during the time of mass incarceration in the United States, and numerous articles concerning Black feminism and gender violence, race, and criminal justice policy, and the social dynamics around issues of sexuality, prison abolition, and grassroots organization in African American communities. She is one of the editors of the long-term Resisting Life Sentences, Working Towards Freedom, with collaborating teachers from Statesville Prison. Her earlier book, Compelled to Crime, The Gender Entrapment of Black Battered Women, is taught in many college courses and is cited in popular press for its original arguments concerning race, gender, and crime. Dr. Ritchie is currently working on a new book entitled Abolition Feminism Now, with Angela Y. Davis, Gina Dent, and Erica Miners. Her work has been supported by grants from the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, the Ford Foundation, and the National Institute for Justice and the National Institute of Corrections. She has been awarded the Audre Lorde Legacy Award from the Union Institute, the Advocacy Award from the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, and the Visionary Award from the Violence Intervention Project and the UIC Woman of the Year Award. Dr. Ritchie is a board member of the Institute on Domestic Violence in the African Community, the National Network for Women in Prison, A Call to Men, and founding member of Insight, Women of Color Against Violence. In 2013, she was awarded an honorary degree from the City University of New York's Law School, and in 2014, she was appointed as senior advisor to the NFL to work on their gender violence prevention program. So Dr. Beth Ritchie, thank you so much for joining us and in this discussion, and I'm gonna let you, go. For me, even after being home and kind of doing this work, and this is one of the things that you spoke about in that lecture, there's this issue of racial justice. And I know that's something that has been focused on, and one of the things that I would speak about. And even in some of these criminal justice organizations or civic organizations, they tended to want me to come speak about issues, but they focused on the racial justice aspect. And it seemed like to a certain extent, sometimes they swayed away from the gender violence aspect of the story, even sometimes not even wanting to mention that part of it. So can you speak more, towards that and why that is? And then later I have some quotes from my book that I kind of want to show of what my mindset was and how you helped me focus on the bigger picture. That's kind of loaded. Thank
No,
you.
it's all good.
Okay.
Am I off? Good
Yes,
morning,
I can hear you.
everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes.
I always forget that part of coming off mute. Whew, well, I am moved, a little overwhelmed for a Saturday morning, I have to say. But I want to start by just expressing such gratitude for you, Kemba, and your family. I'm so grateful to still be in the arms of this sort of love work that you do. You taught me a great deal. I remember those train rides to visit you at Danbury, and I would go with such profound excitement, and I would come home with such a feeling of being fulfilled by our conversations and how you were making sense of your life and teaching me. And now you're teaching so many people about that struggle that you just talked about, of the nexus between gender violence against Black women and the mass incarceration, and the profound ways that history moved me, the profound ways that was then, and it's also now. So thank you for all of your teaching, for me personally, and for changing the world through your teaching. I'm really excited to be part of this really important discussion this morning. I love that you focus on love, because that's really sometimes left out of this discussion. And I want you to know that there are very few people I love and admire more than you. You're inspiring. Okay. So I want to say a few things. First, about my point of view, that is always about bringing an understanding of gender justice into a discussion of racial justice. And this really did come from not something that I thought about, but something that I felt and lived, and the work I have done. Yes, I was in New York for a long time. Now I'm in Chicago. And I remember working for a racial justice organization in Harlem at the time and working on education and housing advocacy and making sure that the environment was safe and access to good health care. And all of that was framed as racial justice issues, just like so many issues today are framed as racial justice issues. And very seldom was a discussion about freedom from domestic violence, sexual assault prevention, making sure that girls have the same access to jobs and educational opportunity as boys. And I remember thinking that the discussion of racial justice was completely inadequate unless it attended to issues that girls were facing too. And I started working then on gender justice issues, primarily through my work in a domestic violence and sexual assault program, and hearing about street harassment and child sexual abuse, and again, trigger warnings, and the ways that women were harassed in schools that meant they dropped out of schools, and domestic violence, and all of these discussions around gender justice. And I would have to keep raising my hand, but for Black women, and probably for other women of color, but for Black women, there's particular ways that that happens. And before I would finish my sentence, people would say, no, we're talking about all women. I said, yeah, but Black women face it in a particular kind of way. So it's this constant needing to make sure that race and gender are included in this discussion that kind of has brought me to the work that I do today. So I write and teach and try to do activism around these parallel issues: ending gender-based violence and increasing racial justice, particularly looking at that huge way that the criminal illegal system forces Black women in particular ways into jails, prisons, detention centers, house arrest, etc. And the history was beautiful to set the stage for us understanding what happens today. I do that work because I feel like the problems of gender justice and violence and criminal legal issues that affect Black women in particular ways are actually linked to a broader set of issues, linked to health issues, linked to poverty, linked to lack of educational attainment, clearly linked to substance abuse. It's linked to the ways that we lose our children at hugely disproportionate rates to child protective services. And that's usually about women losing children. Men are protected in a different kind of way. We can talk about that later. Gender violence and running from the criminal legal system lead to homelessness, lead to mental health problems. So what I'm arguing here is if we look at gender violence and the criminalization of Black women, I'll say a little bit more what I mean by that, then if we take care of those two problems or work to end those two problems, we're going to increase Black women's health. We're going to decrease Black women's poverty. We're going to provide access to education. We're going to decrease substance abuse. We're going to have unified families, etc. For me, if we end the violence, if we end the criminalization, we'll have a better world, not just for Black women and our families, but for all people, for Black men, for Black boys, for white people. And I say that because part of the work we need to do is to dismantle that prison industrial complex that we just heard how long it's been building up. We need to dismantle that, and we need to find ways for women and girls to be safe. I call myself an abolitionist, and I call myself that because I do understand the history of what it meant to stand up against the degrading inhumanity that came with slavery. And I call myself a contemporary Black feminist abolitionist because I think the dynamic that we understood to be part of the inhumanity of slavery is also apparent in the lives of how some Black women live in intimate relationships. So let me just say a little bit about what I mean by abolition, and then talk a little bit about that dynamic inside intimate relationships. When I say I'm an abolitionist, what I mean is we need fewer jails, prisons, um, cruel social service agencies, because you can be incarcerated even if you're out in the community, right? You're monitored where you go. There's rules that you can't subscribe to. Maybe you're on parole, but maybe you're just under the watchful eye of the Child Protective Services, judging everything you do in caring for your kids, even though you don't have the right resources to do that, right? So we need fewer of the punitive kinds of oversight of people's lives, of Black women's lives. And instead, we need more jobs, more health care. We need more substance abuse treatment, because these aren't criminal justice problems. They're often human needs that are going unmet. As we figure out how to meet the unmet human needs, we need to also deal with harm when it happens. And we need to look at the root causes of what some of that harm is. And mostly we need to believe that people are better than the worst thing that they've ever done, or the worst decisions that they were forced to make. People are better than the worst thing they've ever done, or the worst decisions that they were forced to make. As Kemba said, I have done most of my work with women in prison. And most of you know the increase in women in prison by 700% from 1980 to 2019. Most of the women in prison are Black, second Hispanic. That shouldn't surprise you, way out of proportion to our population. They're also mostly poor. They're mostly have been involved, they're parenting, they're involved in taking care of children, whether it's their own children or their nieces and nephews. Most have chronic health and mental health problems. Most have not received an education. And here's the thing, almost all of them, some studies say 80%, some studies say 75%. In my research, the years, almost 40 years I've been going inside jails and prisons talking to women, I have rarely met a woman who was not in an abusive relationship prior to her incarceration. It's almost, in my experience, almost every single woman has been in an abusive relationships over the sphere of their life, across their lifespan, harmed in social ways, physically harmed, emotionally terrorized, financially harmed. So it's a serious concentration of the overlap in population of women who are in prison and women who have been in abusive relationships. And this is why I think when we talk about the question of self-defense, one of the things we say in the work to end the mass incarceration of primarily Black battered women, because that's who is primarily in prison, Black battered women, is that we have to realize that the way the criminal legal system works, Black women aren't afforded access to the kind of self-defense apparatus that other people are afforded. We have no selves to defend. No selves to defend. We have no self to defend because of the history that we just heard about of institutionalized racism, slavery, and other forms of institutionalized racism. I'm so excited about the new Jill Crow. We have no self to defend because of institutionalized racism and gender violence, ignoring gender violence in the lives of Black women and how those things go together. Because one of the things that happens in prison is the similar dynamic, the reproduction of that dynamic that happens in intimate relationships. So it looks something like this. Manipulation by the person in power, whether it's an abuser or a prison guard. Arbitrary use of authority. You don't decide when you eat, when you turn on and off your lights, whether you have access to medical care. One of the dynamics that women in abusive relationships say, someone else is telling me what the reality is, how I should take care of my kids, what I should eat, how I should dress, who I can talk to on the phone, whether or not I can see my family. Those same things happen to women when they're in prison. And the sort of replication of abuse outside, once you're inside, is profound. I think one of the best examples of this is women who are in abusive relationships often feel like part of the dynamic is having to yield to the sexual desires or sexual advances, sexual needs of someone else. No sexual autonomy. We call it sometimes marital rape, but it doesn't only happen in the context of marriage. Girls who are in relationships with abusive boys often feel like he decides what the sexual relationship is going to be. Women in prison often are faced with the terrible, terrible choice whether to yield to the sexual advance of a prison guard. And if you do, then you might have a little extra time in the yard. You might be able to actually go to the doctor if you're sick. You might actually be able to go and see your family when they come and see you and your visit isn't blocked. That often the use of sexual manipulation as a way to just get what you deserve, have your rights, even as a prisoner, your rights acknowledged, is similar to the dynamic that happens in intimate relationships. Strip searches for women after a visit are an example to me of sexual abuse, legitimate sexual abuse that happens in prison. And if you've been traumatized by sexual abuse on the outside and you have to yield to a strip search just so that you can see your loved ones, that to me is sexual abuse. So what I'm trying to say here is that our understanding of gender violence has to understand how it replicates the abuse that often has happened to women before they are incarcerated and might even be the reason that they're incarcerated. That is manipulation and forced involvement in illegal activity and taking the rap for a partner, or sometimes it's holding drugs, isn't it? Sometimes it's holding weapons. Sometimes it's not turning someone in, right? We know this story, don't we, Kemba? Right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay. So let me just say a few other things about this dynamic that's really important. And I know that many of you have thought about this already, maybe talked with each other. The thing that's a dynamic, both in women's forced involvement in illegal activity and confinement in abusive relationships, is that it's a slippery slope. This is important. It doesn't, women don't enter into relationships and the first thing that happens is they're abused. No, what happens first is a kind of um, manipulated romance. You look great in that outfit. I want you to wear that outfit more. I don't want you to wear that outfit around them because you look so good in that outfit. I don't want them looking at you. Why did you wear that outfit? Why were you walking by him when he's looking at you, right? That's the slippery slope. It starts to be controlling. In the beginning of a relationship, we get a text thinking about you. That's nice. It makes us feel like we're connecting with someone. Thinking about you, where are you? Oh, I'm here. Why didn't you answer me? I'm coming over there to see you. I said I'm coming to see you. Get ready. And so that the way that a relationship starts out as engaged and then becomes manipulative is very hard to know where it sort of starts and stops. Slippery slope. Intimacy makes this worse because all of us desire intimacy in our lives. And so we don't I don't hear often from women who've been in abusive relationships that I can't stand it, right? I hear more like, I loved him so much. There were so many good things I got from that relationship. I want to stay connected. And so the care, it's really different than being hurt by a stranger or hurt by someone you don't like. There's a care involved that makes it sometimes hard to leave. For Black women, there's also something that I call the trap of loyalty. Because we know if we call a hotline, they're going to say, call 911 if you're hurt. And you think, call 911? These days, you call 911, you don't know what's going to happen. Are they going to come? Who are they going to hurt along the way? Are they going to arrest me? 25% of women in jail are there because they called for help, and either the police manipulated their arrest instead of the person hurting them, or the person hurting them manipulated the arrest. The police walk in, she has a shoe in her hand or a lamp in her hand, and he says, see what she did? Or he called the police and she ended up in prison. So the trap of loyalty is a complicated one for us as Black women, because we know that police are not necessarily going to be relieving of the harm. There's emotional manipulation and self-doubt that comes from that. We don't want to turn our brothers in. We don't want to be part of the buildup of the prison nation. We know what happens to people when they go to prison. That's not what we want. Instead, what we want is the abuse to stop, right? And in part, what this means is for Black women, we're in a really much more difficult situation because of how strong the prison industrial complex is. It's so strong. We know we can get caught up, and our loved ones can get caught up in a minute. And yet, that's the only system that's offered up when we're experiencing gender violence. So let me just say two more things quickly, because I want to save time for others and for discussion. When I think about what we can do, Kemba, I think you've started it. I mean, we have had some knowledge dropped on us today about history. So the first thing we can do is learn some history, right? Learn about where this all comes from. And it's a history both about racial injustice and how it's institutionalized, it's legal, it's if you look at the history, it's like it's embedded in laws, in policies, in institutions. It's there, right? We also need the history to learn the history of how patriarchy, how male privilege has characterized this nation. There's just one little story about that. It used to be legal to beat your wife as long as you used an instrument that wasn't bigger than your thumb. Some of you have heard the thing, the rule of thumb. The rule of thumb is based on the legalization of the ability to harm your wife, to hit your wife, as long as you didn't use something wider than a thumb. Okay, so learn the history of how gender violence is also supported by institutional practices. Get involved. Write Women in Prison, become a pen pal, go to some of the amazing webinars that are available, get involved in organizations that are trying to both support people while they're inside and set them free. One of the ones I think that's really doing a lot of important work is called Love and Protect. It's a project that has people all over the country, Love and Protect, all over the country, engaging people in campaigns to free people who are in prison, particularly women who are in prison because their survival has been criminalized. Yeah, they were trying to get some bread, or yeah, they were protecting the person who abused them, or yeah, they hurt their kids because they didn't have the resources to not hurt their kids, or they were substance abusing. All of them, to me, are survivors of violence, and we need to set them free. The last thing I want to say, last two things, is you need to take care of each other. No one's going to do this for us. You need to talk to the people you love, make sure they're safe, believe them if they're not, find ways to support them outside of the criminal legal system. Sometimes we do have to use that. I understand that. But also, what can you do to say, you know what, that call, that last call you just got, that didn't sound like love. That sounded like control. I heard how he talked to you about what you're wearing. I don't think that's about care. I think that's about manipulation, right? Listen and talk. Believe survivors, take care when you can, and share what you know. Share what you know. That's what the Kemba Smith Foundation does. This is what I saw the Smith family do to support Kemba. This is what all of us can do in our lives to say, we are going to work with everything we have against racial justice, and we're going to do it attending to gender justice at the same time. I will leave it there and invite whatever's next to this exciting program. So thank you, Kemba, for inviting me.
Well, my goodness. I mean, I need to be in you all's space a little bit more often. But thank you so very much for all of what you both have deposited today. And I hope that it could be beneficial to everyone logged on. And we will connect in the future. But I did want to show this slide, and I'll make sure too the resources Love and Protect that it's attached to the foundation. Vicki McGill, she's on here. She helps me techno wise and with the foundation, but we'll make sure that's listed as well. So with the slides, quotes, I know you all have been reading my book, Poster Child. These were quotes on certain pages that spoke to the relationship, the intimacy, and the way that I felt, while I was incarcerated. And basically, I said love blinded me to the fact that I was risking my life to be with him. I felt like he really needed me to be there with him and for him. I didn't know what type of help I could be to him, so I offered my love. So he decided I would stay with him. And at this point, I lost myself. There was no more Kemba, only Khalif's girlfriend. And as Khalif told me, if I ever did go home, I would have to deal with a lot of heat. And I was so concerned about his well-being that, again, I forgot my own. And I think, Beth definitely spoke to the intimacy and loyalty to a fault that we can have as Black women. And I don't know how far along you all are in the story, but there was a particular point where I knew that they had put Peter on the most wanted list, and they were saying that, he could get the death penalty. So here I was pregnant, with our child, and, I was fearful to, turn him into the authorities. So Beth really did speak to that dynamic, and not only was there some sense of loyalty to the relationship, there was more so fear at that point as well, because he had killed his best friend for cooperating with the authorities. But then there was also this dynamic of, wow, they could kill my son's father if I turned him into the authorities. So just again, Beth, thank you for helping me recognize these points even more so. And so with moving forward with the program, my friend Andrea James, and when we talk about Black women in mass incarceration, she has an organization called National Council on Incarcerated and Formerly Incarcerated Women and Girls. She's a friend of mine. We're comrades in this fight for justice. She's founder of this organization. She also is an author of Upper Bunkers Unite. And she also is formerly incarcerated, and she started this Free Her conference. And I just wanted to let you all have access to this information, and maybe we can have her as a guest in a later session.
No longer will we rely on somebody else telling our stories. We will tell our own.
In recent years, the number of incarcerated women has been growing at an alarming rate.
Women are the fastest growing segment of the prison population. I was one of those women.
I was one of them.
And I was one of them.
Do you know that the United States is responsible for 30%
of the world's female prisoner population,
despite only having 5% of the world's population?
The number of incarcerated women have increased over 700%.
Between 1980 and 2014,
I was one of them.
I was one of them.
I was one of them.
Nearly 3/4 of incarcerated women have children under the age of 18.
stripping society of its mothers.
The mission of the National Council for Incarcerated and Formerly Incarcerated Women and Girls is to end the incarceration of women and girls.
We are strengthening communities and helping keep all families together.
Together, we are creating a space for women's voices to be heard.
Together, we can build momentum to free her.
Free her.
Free her. Free her.
Free her.
Free her.
Free her.
Free her. Free her.
Free her.
Hashtag free her.
Free her!
The last video, and I'm going to try to keep it together still. But Andrea and her organization, I mentioned in the previous session about a friend of mine, Michelle West, that actually was the first person. She was the first person that told me that I was going to be released from federal prison. And she is still in prison. And so this organization is launching a campaign. And I wanted to make sure you all are some of the first people to able to see this short video clip with their campaign.
The United States is one of the top incarcerators of women in the world. With over 231,000 women and girls incarcerated in the United States, now is the time for direct and immediate action. We believe a prison will never be the place for a woman or a girl to heal and advance her life. This is the story of Michelle West. She has been incarcerated since 1993 with 2 life sentences plus 50 years. Michelle is a mother who has been incarcerated for the last 28 years due to the actions of a man she was dating. In 1987, at the age of 32, Michelle, a devoted mother to her 10-year-old daughter, began dating the wrong man after exiting a tumultuous marriage. After they began dating, and completely unbeknownst to Michelle, her new boyfriend had a man killed over stolen money. Despite having no knowledge of her boyfriend's plans, she was charged and convicted on charges of aiding and abetting a drug-related murder and conspiracy to distribute a controlled substance, becoming the central figure in the drug conspiracy case that held her responsible for the actions of her co-defendant and boyfriend, and the man he hired to commit the murder. The man who pulled the trigger received immunity for testifying against Michelle and did not serve any time for the murder he confessed to. And even though it was Michelle's first offense, and she didn't participate in the violence in any way, she was convicted of felony murders as if she had pulled the trigger herself. She received 2 life sentences plus 50 years. In spite of this miscarriage of justice, Michelle has an exemplary prison record and has maintained a close and loving relationship with her only daughter, Mikkel. After nearly 3 decades, Michelle deserves to be reunited with her family. Maya Angelou said, "I come as one, but I stand as 10,000. Today, I arrive a mother, a daughter, a sister, and an aunt. I am only here because of the grandmothers and mothers, the aunties and mentors, the caregiving women that held safe spaces in the pit of their palms and grace for us all. We demand true justice and a healing path away from the incarceration of women and girls. We do not have time for anything less than freedom."
Hopefully, because I helped with trying to get Michelle West's sentence commuted with Trump's last few days, and I was told that she was on the list, and it didn't. Still advocating for Michelle and others, and so that is information with regard to the campaign. And in closing, before we open up for questions, I just want to remind you of our next session, which will be Saturday, March 19th. And on this slide, you will see Susan Burton. And even in the video that you saw, they talked about women having safe spaces. And Susan Burton is a powerhouse in her own right. She's also a formerly incarcerated woman, and she has safe houses across the country, but she started in the state of California, where she has a new way of life reentry project. And that's actually where Talitha and I met, and she brought us together in Virginia because she knew that we would be a good match. But the end quote on this program, this slide today, this session is: mass incarceration is a symptom of a larger problem, which I call Americanism, classism, racism, and capitalism. are the driving forces behind our broken justice system, which is a quote from Susan Burton. So I know we've dropped a lot on you all today. So really want to hear from the young people participants. If you have any comments, questions, feel free to ask or make a comment.
Oh yeah, I wanted to say that also great talks today. Like Kemba said, it was very moving, and a lot of information that I didn't know, and that's kind of what my comment / question is about. It's like kind of frustrates me that that it wasn't as going through the American education system, you talk about racism, and it's just kind of this past event, but I don't know if I don't know why they don't teach it more. I can see it kind of being is it too, like, that's kind of my question. Why is it not in the American education system to kind of talk about these atrocities much more in detail? Because, they kind of just gloss over, and it's just kind of part of history. And that's, you just talk about slavery, and then slavery ends, and they don't talk about how, essentially making it legalized, and you can find loopholes around it to essentially enslave people anyway, even though it's legal now. They don't talk about that. And I was wondering if there's any way that we'll eventually get there, or is just, why is it not a part of the education system today?
I can quickly answer that question and just say that, there are some attempts among historians in particular that I know who are helping to revise some of these U.S. history textbooks to include the stories of people who were ensnared in the convict leasing system, and to create more inclusive history that actually it includes our history, it includes African American history and various aspects of that history. But the simple answer is racism. I mean, it's just that simple. The U.S. education system is one of the most racist institutions in America. And so until that, changes, and it is, there's definitely been some change, but that change has come as a result of pressure, being put on people in leadership or in authority to make those decisions to include our history. And it's a battle. It's a battle.
I would agree with that. The only thing I would add is that, if you have education, information, then you have power.
Yep.
And power is very threatening to people who consolidate their power. And so, one of the things that we do on a college campus is make sure that students can have access, like to a Black Studies class or a Women's Studies class. And I think that's one site of taking power, but there's also a lot of more popular education opportunities to learn history, a lot of zines, a lot of videos, places where, when we're stuck at home, right? When we're sitting at home and trying to look on Netflix about what to watch, you can watch 13th, the video 13th, right? Or you can watch some of the videos about gender violence. And so there's a way that we can look to the institution to change, which we have to do, but we also can change it in what we talk about, what we consume, what we describe. So yeah, education, get it, and then use it.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Stephen, for that question. And anyone else have any comments, questions?
I'd like to say something.
Okay, go ahead, Amaya.
With everything that I've learned today, it just shows that there is so much that we don't know about everything. Like, this country has only been a country for 400 years. And the fact that even though so much has happened, so much good and bad, there is still so much more that we need to do to improve. The fact that people are still trying to find ways to discriminate other people, to put people in different boxes to make them superior over others, it just shows how people are so focused on hate rather than being together in love. And from me being in school, from my age, being in the group, the age group that I'm in, people like they're focused on the right thing, but they don't want to take the steps to do the right thing and get to where we need to be. And it just shows like you just got to keep learning and learning and truly being able to understand what is going on so we can, you know, progress farther to where we need to be, because there's a whole lot more that we got to do.
Wow, thank you, Amaya. I'm glad you were able to capture that. Anybody want to comment to her response? Okay.
Yeah, I like the keep learning part. And, you know, you obviously have an open heart and an open mind. I can't wait to see what kind of leader you probably already are a leader. I don't know you, but
She is.
That's clear. That was clear. But I can't wait to keep following you and your lead. So thank you for your comment and for your leadership.
You're welcome.
Well, we thank you all so very much for joining us today. And thank you all so much, Dr. Beth Ritchie and Dr. Talitha LaFlouria. I really appreciate you both. I'm so blessed to have you amongst my circle. So thank you so much for joining us.